In fact, it might even be less. Let's bring in Steve Saxon, who heads McKinsey and Company's travel and logistics and also infrastructure work in China. He joins us right now. They have a survey and they have a lot of data on this that tells us maybe a little bit more on trends. Steve, a pleasure to have you on the show. Let's start with something simple. Many people we talk to say life is back to normal in China. Why then aren't we seeing that translate into travel?
Thank you. Well, life was relatively back to normal. When we surveyed people back in November, December, the confidence levels in travel, at least domestic travel, were almost back to pre-crisis levels. However, there have been a few sporadic outbreaks, and China, being naturally very cautious on this, has put in place tight travel restrictions through this Lunar New Year. And therefore, we're seeing 75% down in terms of air bookings, for example, versus what we saw 2 years back.
Is that a function of one of the things you mentioned, which is you have restrictions, you have obviously local governments also encouraging people to stay. And I was looking at your survey. Talk to us a little bit more about this. Is this also because people are afraid?
It's partially because people are afraid. The confidence level has fallen back. But I think consistent with what we see around the world, it's actually the travel restrictions in place which are stopping people traveling more than the fear of the virus itself. Those travel restrictions include, in many cases, you need to have a test before you're allowed to return home. Some places have put in place quarantines. Some people with children at school are just not allowed to travel if they want their children to return to school. And it's those restrictions which are keeping people in the cities and stopping the mass migration.
Right. Now, I would imagine people aren't just staying home anyway. This probably has also some benefits. Who's benefiting the most? Are we looking at, staycations, that sort of thing? To what extent are we seeing that right now taking place?
So within the major cities, there's definitely an uptick. So many of I'm in Shanghai now. Shanghai would have emptied out. The attractions, the local hotels within Shanghai are seeing upticks in terms of staycations. A particular winner is actually the very top end of travel, the luxury travel. Chinese New Year was a time when many would have left the country. They would have gone to Hong Kong or Japan or Korea. Obviously, with those borders being closed, some of that spending is being redirected domestically. So if there is a bright spot, it's actually the upper luxury end of the travel market.
Okay, I guess the follow-up will be a two-part question. And what is then the McKinsey assumption of when global travel returns to normal? That's one part. The other part is, if that's perhaps a next year story, is 2021 geared up to be the best year for domestic travel in China, in your view?
So the reopening of international borders is going to take some time. And we make a difference between those countries who are at zero or very close to zero domestic transmission of cases. It's been a very hard-won battle by the populations in these countries, and having vaccines which are 90% effective or tests which are 95% accurate is just not good enough. Like even today, there are tens of cases every day coming into China, being caught at the borders at quarantine, and those people, in theory, have already been tested. So it's clear that until the Chinese population itself is fully vaccinated, China can't be confident in reopening the international borders. That's therefore going to be some time. It's likely end of this year, maybe 2022, before we see a full relaxation. Some could start earlier, though.
Right, and the expectation, that's the hope. So I wanted to pick up then, first, is that the right thing, you think, in terms of guidance? Is it zero or nothing? Because if it's not that, I would imagine then the feasibility of any travel bubbles, and we were just talking about this 2-3 months ago, Singapore, Hong Kong, that sort of thing. If we don't get zero or nothing, does that mean actual travel bubbles between two countries can't happen until everyone is safe?
So I think we see two ways for travel to open. The first is countries which are not at zero, which are sort of managing and balancing the pandemic. It's easier for them to open to each other. And we're starting to see some of that. Some countries in Europe saying, look, show us a vaccination certificate and you can come in without quarantine. And so transatlantic travel, things like that, may actually open up earlier. because letting one case in because you've missed it or something is less of an issue if you're sort of managing a low level of pandemic in the general population. China and other countries which are adopting a sort of near zero policy, though, can't afford to let those to take that risk. However, they may open to each other. And so, yes, there was lots of talk about travel bubbles last year, back in kind of October, November time. We could see some of that come back. Give it a month where China and maybe Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia continue to be zero or close to zero, and we could see some tentative reopening steps between those countries.
Yeah, and maybe the Olympics can happen. Anyway, that's for a different conversation. Talk to us then, as a final question then, after all of this, and hopefully, obviously, we move on to this fairly quickly. Are there any long-term structural changes to the travel industry that you guys see? So
leisure travel, we think, is very robust. We already see huge latent demand. In our survey, more than 40% of the Chinese population wanted to continue to travel internationally on their next trip. I think the more people are locked down within their country, the more they want to go and travel internationally. The structural change is business travel. I think we see probably 20% of business travel never returning, because we've discovered that Zoom video conferences are good for at least some of the interactions. So that will be a structural shift which airlines, hotels, and the events industry all need to deal with.
Steve, thank you for making time for us. Have a great rest of your day, rest of the week, and of course have a great Lunar New Year there in Shanghai.